1932 do 1933 Józef Stalin, dyktator Związku Radzieckiego, zagłodził na śmierć miliony Ukraińców. Było to w wyniku ludobójczego głodu, znanego dziś jako Holodomor. Było to ukryte przed światem. W ten sposób Stalin popełnił zbrodnie, które były najlepiej strzeżonymi tajemnicami historii.
Thank God I didn't kill anyone. I didn't have anyone put away. And I yelled and begged and swore and threatened, of course. Anyone who doesn't bring in grain had better watch out for the punishing sword of the proletarian dictatorship.
Why is it to this day that most people have not heard of the Holodomor? The Holodomor was one of the largest genocides of the 20th century. I think it takes on special significance because it was so long not recognized and was certainly denied by the Soviet government.
Holodomor is a Ukrainian word that means death famine. It was not the product of weather, it was not the product of accident. It was created for political reasons in order to ensure that the Ukrainian peasantry and the Ukrainian intelligentsia didn't become a political problem for Stalin.
Stalin sought through the famine to impose his control on Ukraine.
Without Ukraine, there is no USSR. Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of Europe because it was the center of grain production, originally in the Russian Empire, but also within Europe itself. Most of Russia's grain export came from the Black Earth lands of Ukraine. It's the biggest republic other than Russia. It was the one that was closest to Europe. It was the one that was most European culturally and economically. And Russia simply, without Ukraine, is a faraway northern country, and it didn't have the kind of power and the kind of presence in European politics without Ukraine.
The Ukrainian peasants didn't want to have anything to do with collectivization and fought it. And they fought it much harder than anyone else did. And there were outright battles. I mean, we're talking hundreds of uprisings in 1929, 1930, where Ukrainian peasants, you know, essentially said, we're not going to have anything to do with your collective farms.
Ukraina przegrała walkę o niepodległość po rewolucji żydowsko-radzieckiej, ale początkowo zyskała trochę swobody kulturowej.
There was an increasing attention to Ukrainian national thinking and national distinctiveness within the Soviet Union at the end of the 20s and beginning of the 30s. And this too angered Stalin and the people in the Soviet leadership to the point where they wanted to bring Ukraine under control and make it a Soviet possession, just like all the other republics of the Soviet Union.
The leaders of the Soviet Union are trying to remake the world, and one of their central ideas is that they understand the future. The future limits what they do now. Certain people who are around now essentially have no purpose. And this idea is tested, I think, most dramatically in Ukraine. And Ukraine, because it's the most fertile territory of the Soviet Union, is where the hammer hits hardest.
Zaufany wysłannik Stalina, Paweł Postyszew, otrzymał szerokie uprawnienia dyktatorskie i był wysłany na Ukrainę z armią tajnej policji, aby oczyścić szeregi partii ukraińskiej i wycisnąć ostatnie ziarna zboża. 112 000 zaufanych członków partii z Rosji stacjonuje teraz na Ukrainie. Chronią stojące uprawy i zwierzęta przed głodującymi, brutalnie egzekwując prawo w celu ochronienia własności państwowej.
Finally, the starvation tactics that were designed to eliminate the problem of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian peasant rebellion forever.
Schools were more or less Russified. All the dictionaries were removed and changed so that the language became closer to Russian. Major Ukrainian communist leaders were either put in jail or forced to commit suicide. Major intellectuals committed suicide. So this was a tragic blow to the Ukrainian peasantry and to the Ukrainian culture and elite. Remember, it took place in more or less 5 to 6 months.
Ukraine is literally decimated. The population is devastated, and through that, the culture, the language, the institutions, and everything else.
Teams of people came into Ukraine and went village by village and removed the food from people's houses. Apples, beets, they would lead away the cows, they would take away whatever was in storage.
Не було що їсти. Ми ходили, шукали, де пташка, знаєте, ті перепелки. Це то яєчка брали і їли. А як іде, що ще вже і є перепеленята, але що вони не ростуть, і то так їла. А так, як ішов, на дорозі впав. А люди так падали, як муха. Ще людина дихала. Вони забирали, каже, бо ми не приїдемо завтра забирати.
They passed passport laws that forbade Ukrainians to go, peasantry to go into the cities, and eventually they blocked the entire republic, so people couldn't leave.
The Soviet secret police seal off Ukraine's borders. No one can get out or bring food in. A nation the size of France is strangled by hunger.
Stalin crushed the possibilities of Ukrainian autonomy, Ukrainian self-determination in some ways within the Soviet Union through the actions taken in Holodomor. This was an attack across the board against Ukrainian nationality.
It broke the ability of the society to resist for decades to come. There are many really heartbreaking stories about what was happening there, but probably the ones that touched the most was when people who were really dying were helping others and helping neighbors and trying to save children and elderly while really starving themselves. Many of these policies were conducted by locals in the same villages, by neighbors who were doing that to their neighbors. You never stopped to be amazed about the strength of the human spirit, but also about the depth to which humans can really descend.
W szczytowym momencie głodu, w czerwcu 1933 roku, na Ukrainie umierało 28 000 osób dziennie.
What is impressive is the success of the Soviet effort to control the news. We have now documents proving that they call journalists, they call diplomats in Moscow and, threatened them of expulsion, of not allowing them to work anymore in the Soviet Union if they revealed the extent of the famine. In fact, the first serious scholarly monograph book about the famine was published only in 1986 by Robert Conquest, 53 years after the fact.
Dziennikarz Gareth Jones ryzykował życiem, podróżując na Ukrainę i informując o głodzie. Tam przeprowadził wywiady z ocalałymi i z sowieckimi agentami.
If any man, woman or child goes out into the field at night in the summer and picks a single ear of wheat, then the punishment according to law is death by shooting, the communists explained to me.
Jones opisał tak zwane prawo 5 kłosów pszenicy, podpisane przez Michała Kalinina, szefa Centralnego Komitetu Wykonawczego ZSRR i Wieczysława Mołotowa, przewodniczącego Rady Komisarzy Ludowych. Wykorzystujcie represje sądowe w najwyższym stopniu, jako środki ochrony socjalnej przeciwko kradzieży majątku rolnego. Wykonujcie egzekucję przez rozstrzelanie i konfiskujcie całe mienie.
Although there is journalistic writing on this period on it, there were also voices who wished to contradict that testimony. Of course, Walter Duranty is the major case of a liar on these events.
He was not only the greatest liar among the journalists in Moscow, but he was the greatest liar of any journalist that I ever met in 50 years of journalism. And we used to wonder whether, in fact, the authorities hadn't got some kind of hold over him, because he so utterly played their game. But it didn't worry the New York Times, who featured his reports. When it came to the famine, the great famine in the Ukraine, brought about by collectivization, that was when his reporting was particularly disgraceful, because he denied that there was any famine.
Jak pokazują archiwalne dokumenty brytyjskiego Ministerstwa Spraw Zagranicznych. W prywatnych rozmowach z zagranicznym urzędnikiem Duranty stwierdził, że głód zabił ponad 10 milionów ludzi.
The Soviet authorities put pressure on journalists or gave them inducements to tell the story very differently. And some of these journalists were then expelled by the Soviet authorities, such as Ria Kleiman.
People who did try to write about it, particularly outside of the USSR, were often accused of being right-wingers or working for the CIA. There was a kind of campaign that would be run against anybody who would try to describe this problem.
They forced them into the lie. You're either going to lie along with us or you're going to be purged.
Пізніше вже, як я до школи почала ходити, все мовчало. Ніхто нічого не говорив, бо не вільно було говорити. І мама все каже, нічого не говоріть. Мовчала, все мовчало.
You could not even weep your dead, mourn. This was forbidden. Actually, you had to say that everything was fine. You had to deny what you had seen, that your son, your daughter, your husband, your wife, your father, your mother died of hunger under your own, while you were watching, but you could not say this. So I think there were very deep psychological consequences.
The hundreds or thousands of petitions, very often from children, which are sent up with the thought, with the hope, the assumption that someone higher up is going to know, care, be able to do something about it.
Все таке було, що ми молодості не мали ніколи. Вся молодість пішла, бозна куди. І пережили все це те, що нам не треба було. А комуністична система зробила нас найгіршими рабами в світі. І ми осталися винуваті. Не знати тільки за що. За які гріхи. Тільки того, що ми звалися українцями.
In many of the places where the famine was most devastating, Russians were brought in to replace Ukrainian villagers. In other words, the nature of the country changed after the famine.
What happens in Ukraine, it wouldn't be wrong to see it as a kind of colonization. It was a horrible blow to Ukrainian national identity, social solidarity, political trust, from which I think it's fair to say Ukrainians are still recovering.
It was only in the last years of the Soviet Union that the truth about the famine, about the number of victims and the causes of the famine became part of the public discourse.
Study of the Holodomor, like the study of any great tragedy, is extremely important in order to understand the nature of the modern world, in order to understand how human beings think and act.
We should study it as a terrible tragedy of the history of genocide, in the hopes, again, that people will not allow such things to recur.
Niektóre regiony Ukrainy, najbardziej dotknięte ludobójczym głodem, ponownie cierpią z powodu rosyjskiej agresji. Podobnie jak Stalin, Władimir Putin zaprzecza, że Ukraina jest niezależnym krajem.
Stalin really didn't believe that Ukrainians had their own nation and nationality. What Putin's goals are in Ukraine, what he wants to accomplish. Some people think he simply wants to destabilize Ukraine. Some people think he wants more territory.
Rosyjska inwazja Ukrainy naruszyła prawa międzynarodowe, w tym konwencję genewską, Kartę Organizacji Narodów Zjednoczonych, porozumienia helsińskie, karty OBWE, memorandum budapesztańskie z 1994 roku, 2 traktaty przyjaźni rosyjsko-ukraińskiej, Międzynarodową konwencję w sprawach likwidacji wszelkich form dyskryminacji rasowej oraz liczne zasady Europejskiego Trybunału Praw Człowieka.
The situation in Ukraine is very destabilizing for the region and for Europe as a whole, for the world as a whole.
Okrucieństwa przeszłości są ważne jako lekcje na dziś. Wszyscy jesteśmy obywatelami globalnej wioski i jesteśmy powiązani w walce między wolnością a uciskiem, nadzieją i strachem, suwerennością i tyranią. Walka Ukrainy z żydowskimi tyranami o wolność i niepodległość terytorialną nadal trwa.